All right, now we're going to briefly fight our way through the entire Atlantic theater of the war, over there on the front with the Germans. Again, this is giving very short shrift to a very long and important war, but this is how we're going to do it. If you were hoping for a whole lot of military detail and campaigns and so forth, there are plenty of places that you can find that information. I'm just going to kind of give you the outline of what happened. So, looking at the map here, the dark magenta countries are the members of the Axis powers right around the time the war was about to start. And you'll notice this includes Czechoslovakia because they had been annexed by Germany. The lighter magenta colors are those areas, those countries that came under control by the Axis powers, mostly, the Germany and Italy working together. And you'll see that is pretty much all of Europe, except for the British Isles. Fortunately, the English Channel was there separating Britain from the rest of Europe, so there couldn't be a land invasion. Also, you'll notice that Spain is there among the neutral countries. That's because they had just fought that civil war, but they were fascist under Franco. And Sweden, you'll note, maintained their neutrality. So if you look at these light magenta areas and you go to the east over to the right, you'll see that the German advance into the Soviet Union got as far as the city of Stalingrad, and then it stopped. And that's because the Germans were stopped at Stalingrad. They got there in August 1942, expecting just to roll over that city like others. However, the Russians concentrated their forces to come to the relief of the city, and the city held out with just an absolutely Herculean effort on the part of not only Russian soldiers, but Russian civilians there in the city resisting. And it became a siege and dragged on for months, 5 months. So the invasion there started in the summer. Remember what I said? It's never a good idea to try to invade Russia in the winter. So the invasion started in summer, but because they were held up for so long, winter overtook them. And it was a very harsh, typical Russian winter. And the Germans were held back. So that's as far as they were able to get into Russia. Now, as for the other allies, we're going to start down in the lower right corner of the map, and we're going to trace the route of the Allies as they fought their way through the Axis powers into Europe. So the first star there, the first major battle, is El Alamein in October, late October of 1942, through to November the 5th, Guy Fawkes Day, as it turns out. So there you had the Axis powers, and when we talk about the Axis powers in North Africa and in Europe, we're talking about Germany and Italy primarily. So the Axis powers versus the Allies. The U.S. had entered the war by this time, but they had spent, they had immediately started fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and had to do some preparations to get to Europe to start the fighting there. So when we're talking about the Allies, at this point, we're talking about primarily the British and the Free French who were present in North Africa. But at the Battle of El Alamein, it was the British. And when we say the British, we're not talking just specifically about the United Kingdom of Great Britain. We're talking about what is referred to as the British Commonwealth, which is the nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, but also its colonies, and it had a lot of colonies at this point, and also several independent countries that had previously been colonies of Great Britain and continued to maintain an allegiance to the British king or queen. So that includes Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, also South Africa. It does not include the United States, not part of the British Commonwealth, because they did not maintain that allegiance to the British crown. So, British versus Axis forces at El Alamein. This was an important battle because the Allies won, and this prevented the Axis powers, the Germans and Italians, from getting any further into Egypt or any further into the Middle East, which was very important because what's in the Middle East? A whole lot of oil. And oil is extremely important at this point when you're trying to keep a war machine running. So, kept them from going any farther east at El Alamein, and at the same time the siege of Stalingrad was going on that kept them from going any further east into Russia. Now, as you travel along the coast of North Africa, you come to the next big star, Kasserine Pass, which is there in Tunisia. There was a battle there, a major battle between the Allies and the Axis forces, and this one is significant because it is the first battle in which American troops were present fighting against the Germans in World War II. So this is a year after the U.S. entered the war, but all the fighting had been with the Japanese up to this point. So the Americans are there along with the British. The Americans took very heavy losses. They weren't used to this type of desert fighting, and it took some readjusting after this battle. However, the pass was held. After that, by the time that North Africa was pretty well taken control of by the Allies by the spring and summer of 1943, the next stage of the war was going to be the invasion of Sicily, launched from Tunisia. So the Allies, U.S., British, etc., are going to go across the Mediterranean into Sicily, the toe of the Italian boot, as it were. This was referred to as the soft underbelly strategy, the thinking being that Italy would be easier to fight through than the places held by Germany in Western Europe. There was some political dissension in Italy by this time because the war had not been going well. They hadn't done well at all in North Africa, so there was that to consider. There was also the idea that perhaps the invasion of Europe should start in Western France, but they decided to come up through Italy, thinking that would be the easier route to take. So, in July 1943, Allies landed in Sicily, fought for several weeks, and by August had taken control of Sicily and then started fighting their way up through Italy in September of 1943. Around the time that was happening, I mentioned that there was some political division in Italy. A lot of people were starting to get a little bit doubtful about this whole Axis powers, let's conquer the world thing. And the Italian version of Parliament had a vote of no confidence for their prime minister, Benito Mussolini, Il Duce. So he was defeated as leader of Italy and immediately arrested and put in jail by the new Italian government. However, this new Italian government still has to contend with the fact that there are these armies invading them. So they did continue fighting. The Germans actually captured the area where Mussolini was imprisoned and freed him just a couple of months later and set him up in a little puppet government in northern Italy. But he wasn't much more of a factor for the rest of the war. From there, the Allies continue going up northward through Italy, and eventually Italy surrenders, which brings us finally to late spring, early summer of 1944, at which point the Allies, under the command of the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, were planning another invasion of Europe, this time from the west, this time from across the English Channel, from Britain into the area of France known as Normandy. It was top secret. The countdown to the launch of the invasion was referred to as, the invasion was referred to as D-Day. This is the day it's going to happen. But they didn't want word to get out. They didn't want the Germans to know that's what they were going to do. The area was heavily fortified by the Germans, but if they knew for sure the Allies were going to attack on a certain day, it would be even more heavily fortified. The fact is, the Germans believed that the Allies were going to continue coming up through Italy, and they were going to try to invade Germany from that direction. So that's where they had their forces kind of focused and concentrated. Hence the importance of the element of surprise. And as they were making preparations over in Britain with Canadian forces and U.S. forces and various other allies of the British, they went to great lengths to camouflage their operations, literally, in some cases, so that German planes from the air wouldn't be able to see exactly what they were doing and know that the invasion was coming. D-Day arrived June the 6th, 1944, and Allied forces did indeed cross the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy, where they took heavy losses. It was very hard fighting, but they did manage to eventually overwhelm the German forces there on those beaches and then start traveling westward. They liberated Belgium and the Netherlands, and they got right up to the border of Germany. Now, at the same time, the Russians had started traveling westward and fighting through the German forces in that area around Ukraine. Well, the Germans launched a counter-offensive. They had managed to get their forces back up that had been down there in Italy to reinforce them, and they pushed back hard against the Allies right there on the front line. And in this offensive, in the forests of western Germany, the Germans actually, over that winter, 1944 and 45, pushed back westward against the Allies and regained some of the area the Allies had taken, therefore putting a big bulge in the line. So it's not a straight line. There's a big part of the German part that extends over into Belgium. That's why this is called the Battle of the Bulge. It was about 6 weeks of hard winter fighting, and ultimately the Allies won. And then they started by the spring of 1945. The British and Americans and Free French forces were advancing eastward into Germany. At around the same time, the Russians had taken Poland and were advancing westward on the western border of Germany and into Germany. Finally, in May 1945, a lot of the German territory in the German country had been taken. The leadership of the country was clustered there in Berlin, and they had the Americans and the British coming from one direction, and they were almost there. The Russians coming from the other direction, and they were almost there. And Berlin was besieged and was sure to fall soon. And that's when Hitler committed suicide in his bunker there in Berlin. And the whole thing fell apart, and Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over in May 1945. Even though we're not going into a lot of military detail, here are some significant players on both sides that you should be familiar with. First, from the war in North Africa, which was fought on desert terrain and was largely fought with tanks. One of the more important American commanders there was General George Smith Patton, who was quite a character. He was a brilliant tactician. It had been his idea for the cavalry to transition to tank warfare, and he believed that, sort of similar to the German concept of blitzkrieg, that those tanks should move in fast and punch holes in the enemy lines. He was known for being a really crusty individual, very profane, swore a whole lot, was known to smack soldiers around sometimes. And later, when the Allied forces were advancing into Germany in the spring of 1945, when his tanks reached the Rhine River and were about to enter into German territory, he stopped the whole thing and in front of all of his men stood on the bridge and urinated into the river just to demonstrate how he felt about Germany. He was actually killed a few weeks after the war ended in a Jeep accident. His nemesis in North Africa was the German general Erwin Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox, also a brilliant military strategist who, although he was on the losing end on those two battles, important battles in North Africa we just talked about, early on had a lot of victories and was very, very popular and, in fact, beloved by the German people. He was one of their great heroes. He also was one of the people involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944, right after the Germans had lost at DDay and had lost France. A lot of German officers in the high command believed that Hitler really wasn't the best leader and he wasn't all that emotionally and mentally stable, and they felt like the war was definitely lost by that point, and that Germany was going to be pounded into rubble if they didn't surrender, and Hitler refused to entertain the idea of surrender in any form. So several of these high-ranking generals put together a plan to blow Hitler up, which ultimately it didn't go off as planned. There was a bomb in a briefcase at a meeting that Hitler was in, and Hitler actually got up and moved before the bomb went off, and so he received only minor injuries. And all the conspirators were discovered, and Rommel, because he was a beloved national hero, his name was kind of kept out of it where the public was concerned at that point. All the other conspirators were rounded up and quickly publicly executed. Rommel was given the option of taking cyanide and committing suicide quietly, and that if he took that route without a trial or a public execution, he was promised that his family would be protected and cared for. So he took that option, and that was the end of Rommel. Also here you've got General Dwight David Eisenhower of Kansas, whom we have mentioned several times, and boy, we'll be mentioning him a lot more in coming lectures. He was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Atlantic or European theater. So he was in charge over really all the forces, not just the U.S. His counterpart in the Pacific theater was Douglas MacArthur, whom we've also talked about quite a bit and will be talking about quite a bit more even after World War II. He did have his victorious and triumphant return to the Philippines when the Philippines were taken back from the Japanese.